The year was 1878, and the world for Cora was a circle of dust no bigger than the hem of her worn-out dress. It was a world bounded by the splintered boards of her lean-to, the mocking silence of the vast prairie, and the cold shoulders of the folks in the nearby settlement of Providence. They were people who saw a girl of 14, orphaned by fever 2 winters past, and saw not a soul to be saved, but a burden to be avoided. Her existence was a quiet apology, a breath held in so as not to disturb the air of those who belong. Her parents had left her little more than a name and a deep-seated ache that lived behind her ribs. They had chased a dream of land and sky out west, a dream that had ended in 2 simple wooden crosses on a windswept hill. Cora was its sole, living inheritor. She survived on the scraps of their failed ambition and the rabbits she was clever enough to snare. Her only companions were the ceaseless wind that whispered of loneliness and a pair of leather shoes, her mother's last gift, cracked and thin-soled, but hers all the same. They were her only tangible link to a life that had once held warmth, the only thing that stood between the bare skin of her feet and the unforgiving earth. Her days followed a rhythm of necessity. Mornings were for checking her snares, her heart a tight knot of hope and fear. Afternoons were for gathering what little the parched land offered. Bitter roots, hardy berries, anything to dull the perpetual gnawing in her belly. Evenings were for mending. She would sit in the fading light, the big sky bruising into nightfall above her, and stitch the seams of her dress, re-sole her shoes with scraps of leather she'd scavenged, and patch the holes in her life with a grim, silent fortitude. She was a creature of routine, hardened by loss into a shape of pure survival, her emotional world as barren as the landscape around her. One afternoon, when the sun hung in the sky like a merciless eye, she saw him. He was a ripple in the heat shimmer at first, a dark shape moving with a staggering, unnatural gait. He was a native man, Lakota from the look of his worn leggings and the single feather tied in his long black hair. The people of Providence spoke of the tribes with a mixture of fear and contempt, tales of savagery spun to justify their own encroachment on ancient lands. Cora had been taught to fear them, but what she saw now was not a warrior. She saw a man collapsing. He fell less than 100 yards from her lean-to, a slow folding of limbs into the thirsty dust. For a long moment, Cora remained frozen, a small, still animal scenting danger. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to let the prairie reclaim what was its own. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. But then the wind shifted, and it carried not a war cry, but a low groan of pain, a sound so profoundly human that it bypassed her fear and struck at the core of her own well-tended sorrow. Slowly, cautiously, she approached. He was young, perhaps only a few years older than she, his face taut with exhaustion and fever. His eyes were closed, his lips cracked and white. But it was his feet that made her gasp. They were a raw, bloody ruin, stripped of skin by the sharp rocks and scorching earth. He had walked himself to the very edge of death. This was a pathwalker, a man on a sacred journey she'd only heard whispered about, a trial of spirit that forbade any assistance. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum of indecision. To help him was to interfere with his gods, to invite trouble from his people, from hers. But to leave him was to be no better than the buzzards already circling high above. She looked at his ravaged feet and then down at her own, protected by her mother's worn leather. The memory of her mother's hand, warm on her cheek, rose in her mind, a ghost of kindness in a cruel world. She made her choice. Scurrying back to her lean-to, she filled her only tin cup with water from her meager barrel. She knelt beside him, lifting his head with a trembling hand, and dribbled the precious liquid onto his lips. He swallowed weakly, a flicker of life returning to his eyes. They opened, dark and unfocused, and locked onto her face. There was no threat in them, only a vast, weary emptiness. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. She shook her head, a gesture meant to convey something she had no words for. Then, acting on an impulse that felt both insane and absolutely necessary, she untied the laces of her own shoes. They were the most valuable thing she owned, her shield against the world. Without a second thought, she slipped them from her feet. The hot, sharp ground bit at her soles immediately. She ignored it. Gently, she lifted one of his ruined feet and slid a shoe over it, then the other. They were too small, of course, but the leather was soft and would offer some protection. He stared at her, a flicker of disbelief, then profound understanding, dawning in his exhausted gaze. He made no move to refuse them. He simply looked at her, and in that look, a silent transaction passed between them, not of debt, but of shared humanity. With a strength that seemed impossible, he pushed himself to his feet. He swayed for a moment, then took a single, steadying step in her shoes. He gave her one last, solemn nod, a promise and a burden all in one, before turning and continuing his staggering walk toward the distant, hazy mountains. Cora stood and watched him go, barefoot and trembling, the dust already hot on her skin. She had just given away her past, and in doing so, had irrevocably altered her future. 3 days passed. Cora's world had shrunk to the searing pain in her feet. The land she had known her whole life had become a field of tiny daggers. Every stone, every thorn, was a fresh torment. She fashioned crude coverings from rabbit hide and twine, but they were a poor substitute for the solid leather she had given away. She was more trapped than ever, her movements hobbled, her isolation now enforced by a physical barrier of pain. She thought of the pathwalker constantly, wondering if he had survived, if her sacrifice had been anything more than a fool's gesture. On the morning of the 4th day, they came. She saw them first as a line of riders on the horizon, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of purpose. They were not from Providence. As they drew closer, her blood ran cold. It was a delegation from the Lakota tribe, at least a dozen men, their faces stern and unreadable, their presence radiating an immense, silent power. They rode directly to her lean-to and drew their ponies to a halt, forming a silent, intimidating crescent around her. Cora stood frozen before her home, her heart a trapped bird beating against her ribs. She was barefoot, clad in her patched dress, a child of no one facing the judgment of an entire people. An older man, his face a beautiful map of wrinkles and wisdom, dismounted. He carried a staff adorned with eagle feathers, a mark of authority. He walked toward her, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. "I am Wapasha," he said, his voice a low rumble, his English careful and formal. "We seek the girl who lives alone." Cora could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She expected anger, accusations of defiling their sacred ritual. "The path, walker, Chaitan, he has completed his journey," Wapasha continued, his dark eyes studying her with an unnerving intensity. "He reached the sunstone at the peak of the sacred mountain. He did this because of a gift he received on the path." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent air. "He arrived wearing these." Another man stepped forward, holding out her shoes. They looked impossibly small and frail in his hands. Cora stared at them, the familiar scuffs and worn stitching a testament to a life she no longer lived. A path, walker's journey, is a solitary covenant between the walker and Wakan Tanka, the Great Spirit, Wapasha explained, his tone not angry, but deeply serious, like a teacher explaining a fundamental law of the universe. The path must be walked by the spirit intended. Chaitan's body reached the sunstone, but his spirit was carried upon your sacrifice. His feet did not make the final connection, yours did. Cora's mind reeled. She could not grasp the full meaning of his words, only the terrifying implication that she had done something terribly wrong. I only wanted to help," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "Your intention was good," Wapasha acknowledged with a slight inclination of his head. "Kindness is a strong spirit, but the journey is now incomplete. A debt has been created. A spirit path, once joined, cannot be easily severed. The final steps were yours in spirit, now they must be yours in body. A cold dread washed over her, more chilling than any winter wind. What do you mean? Wapasha's gaze was unwavering. You must finish what you started. You must walk the final leg of the path. You must place your own feet upon the sunstone. Only then will the covenant be honored. Only then will the path be pure again. The demand hung in the air, impossible and absolute. Her, a white girl, an outcast, to walk a sacred Lakota path, barefoot. The idea was so preposterous, so terrifying, that a hysterical laugh threatened to bubble up from her throat. She swallowed it down, tasting the bitter tang of fear. She looked from Wapasha's unyielding face to the circle of silent riders, and she knew this was not a request. It was a decree, issued by a power far older and greater than the fledgling authority of Providence. She had no choice. Her act of compassion had become a chain, binding her to a destiny she could never have imagined. The journey began not with a step, but with a surrender. Cora, trembling and mute, watched as the Lakota men made a small temporary camp. She was not treated as a prisoner, not bound or threatened, but she was enveloped by their world, her own tiny existence completely subsumed. The following morning, Wapasha and most of the riders departed, leaving behind two figures. One was a young warrior named Kuruk, silent and watchful, a living shadow. The other was a woman. Her name was Winona. She was Chetan's older sister, a fact communicated by Wapasha with a single, meaningful glance before he left. Winona was tall and severe, her face etched with a quiet sorrow that seemed to have hardened into permanent disapproval. She looked at Cora not with hatred, but with a kind of weary exasperation, as if Cora were a foolish complication in an already difficult life. Her first act was to examine Cora's feet, her touch surprisingly gentle, but her expression critical. "The ground will not be kind," Winona said, her English as sparse and sharp as shards of flint. "You are not made for this land." It was not a question, it was a verdict. Their communication in those first days was a thing of gestures and clipped, functional phrases. Walk here, drink now, rest. Cora's world became a blur of pain and endurance. The path they took was not a path at all, but a cross-country trek over stony ground, through thorny brush, and across sun-baked flats that blistered her soles. Every step was an agony. She stumbled, she fell, she cried silent tears that dried instantly in the arid wind. But she never once spoke a word of complaint. The same grim fortitude that had seen her through 2 years of solitary survival now served her on this impossible pilgrimage. Winona watched her. She walked ahead, setting a relentless pace, her own moccasined feet seeming to glide over the terrain that savaged Cora's. At night, by the small fire Kuruk would build, Winona would tend to Cora's feet. She would crush leaves from a plant Cora didn't recognize, mixing them with animal fat to create a soothing, pungent salve. Her hands were firm and efficient, her movements economical, betraying no sympathy. Yet it was an act of care. Cora, who had not been touched with any kindness in years, felt a strange, confusing warmth spread from her battered feet to the frozen core of her heart. One evening, after a particularly grueling day crossing a field of shale that had left Cora's feet bleeding afresh, she finally broke her silence. "Why?" she whispered, staring into the dancing flames. "Why must I do this?" Winona looked up from her work, her needle pausing over a piece of leather she was mending. "Because the spirits see. They do not see the color of skin, they see the heart. Chetan walked the path to ask for a vision, to heal the grief in our family. Our younger brother was taken by the coughing sickness last winter. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but her eyes held a universe of loss. Your kindness touched his journey. It became part of his prayer. Now, your heart must finish the prayer." Cora looked at Winona, and for the first time she saw not a stern warden, but a woman hollowed out by the same grief that Cora knew so well. The chasm between them, the vast cultural and personal distance suddenly seemed a little smaller. A bridge of shared sorrow, fragile but real, began to form in the firelight. As the days bled into a week, the landscape of their relationship began to shift. Winona started to point things out to Cora. A hawk circling overhead was not just a bird, but a messenger. The shape of a cloud held meaning. She taught Cora which plants were for eating and which for medicine. She showed her how to place her feet, to roll from heel to toe, to read the ground and anticipate its cruelty. It was a slow, unspoken tutelage. Cora, in turn, began to absorb the rhythms of the land, her pain lessening as her knowledge grew. One afternoon, they rested in the shade of a small bluff. Kuruk was off scouting, and an unusual quiet settled between the two women. Cora, her hands busy weaving a strip of yucca fiber, as Winona had shown her, found herself speaking of her parents, of their dreams and their deaths, the words spilling out as if a dam had broken. Winona listened without interruption, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. When Cora fell silent, her story told, Winona spoke softly. To lose a family is to have a hole cut from your spirit. My brother, he was like the morning sun. His laugh, gone. She touched a small beaded pouch at her belt. Chaitan walks to fill this emptiness. You walk to heal the wound you did not know you had. In that moment, Cora understood. This journey was not a punishment. It was a form of medicine. The physical pain was a cleansing fire, burning away the isolation, the bitterness, the resignation that had defined her. She was not just walking a path across the land, she was walking her way back to the world of the living. She looked at Winona, whose eyes were now soft with a shared, profound understanding, and knew she was no longer walking alone. They were within a day's journey of the sacred mountain, a jagged blue peak that now dominated the horizon, when their precarious peace was shattered. They had been moving through a narrow, wooded canyon when the voices reached them, rough and loud, echoing off the rock walls. They were white men's voices, sharp with aggression. "Well, look what we have here," one voice drawled. "Looks like a lost lamb." Two men stepped out from behind a cluster of pines, rifles held loosely in their hands. Cora recognized them instantly. It was Garrett, a burly, bearded prospector from Providence, and one of his cronies. Garrett's eyes, small and greedy, raked over Cora, then settled on Winona with a sneer of contempt. "Figured we'd find you," Garrett said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near Winona's feet. "Heard in town, the Lakota snatched the orphan girl. Come to rescue you, little thing." Kuruk, who had been scouting ahead, appeared as if from the earth itself, positioning himself between the women and the prospectors. His face was a mask of cold fury, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "She is not your concern," Kuruk said, his voice a low threat. Garrett laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She's white, ain't she? That makes her our concern. We ain't letting no savage drag her off to God knows where." He took a step forward, raising his rifle slightly. "Now, you and the squaw back off, and we'll take the girl. No one has to get hurt." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Cora's stomach. This was the world she knew, the prejudice and brute ignorance that had kept her an outcast. For a moment, she was the same terrified, helpless girl from the settlement, but then she felt Winona's hand on her shoulder, a brief, firm pressure that was not a restraint, but a reassurance. It sent a current of strength through her. She had walked for days over broken ground, her spirit tempered by pain and fellowship. She was not that girl anymore. "I am not being dragged anywhere," Cora said, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself. "I am with them by choice." Garrett's eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in suspicion. "They got you spooked, is that it? Don't you worry, we'll take care of them." He gestured with his rifle toward Kuruk. "He doesn't look so tough." The situation was escalating, a tinderbox about to ignite. Cora knew that Garrett and his friend were not looking for justice. They were looking for an excuse. An excuse to enact the violence that always simmered just beneath the surface of their dealings with the tribe. They saw a chance to be heroes in their own story, to put the savages in their place. And she was caught in the middle, the unwilling catalyst for a conflict that could only end in bloodshed. The sacred journey had devolved into a raw, brutal struggle for survival. The air in the canyon grew thick and heavy, charged with the promise of violence. Garrett's posture was that of a predator, coiled and ready. He saw a frightened child, a captured prize. He did not see the woman who was being forged in the crucible of this journey. "I said, I am with them," Cora repeated, and this time her voice did not just carry conviction, it carried an authority she had never known she possessed. She took a step forward, deliberately placing herself in front of Winona, shielding her guide with her own small body. It was a mirror image of the moment she had knelt to offer her shoes, an act of instinct and profound connection. "You don't understand," she said, looking directly into Garrett's cruel eyes. "This is my path now. A debt is being paid. It is a holy thing. You cannot interfere." Garrett stared at her, baffled. Her words, her stance, her utter lack of fear was not what he had expected. He had anticipated tears, pleas for rescue. He was met with a priestess defending her temple. The certainty in her voice momentarily broke his aggressive momentum. "Holy thing, girl, you've been out in the sun too long. They've filled your head with nonsense." "The only nonsense here," Winona's voice cut in low and resonant, "is a man who believes his ignorance gives him rights." That remark snapped Garrett's temper. With a snarl, he raised his rifle, leveling it at Kuruk. "That's enough talk." But before he could act, a sound, or rather a lack of it, changed everything. The normal hum of the canyon insects, the wind in the pinshad fallen silent. In that sudden, profound stillness, figures began to emerge from the rocks and trees around them. They moved with the quiet fluidity of ghosts. It was Wapasha, his face grim. It was Chaitan, his body healed and strong, his eyes fixed on Cora with an expression of fierce pride. And with them were a dozen more warriors, appearing on the ridges above, bows in hand, their presence a silent, undeniable answer to Garrett's aggression. They had been there all along, a protective shadow shepherding their sacred task to completion. Garrett and his friend froze, their faces paling as they realized their gross miscalculation. They were no longer two armed men cornering a woman and a girl. They were two fools trapped in a canyon, surrounded by a people they had fatally underestimated. The power dynamic had shifted completely and irrevocably. Chaitan stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Garrett. He did not speak. He did not have to. His presence, standing tall and whole, was a testament to the power that Garrett and his kind could never comprehend. He was the living embodiment of a world built on spirit and resilience, not on greed and force. Wapasha finally broke the silence, his voice calm but carrying the weight of the mountains themselves. "You have trespassed on sacred ground and threatened those under our protection. Leave, now, and do not return." There was no argument. Garrett and his companion lowered their rifles, their bluster collapsing into panicked haste. They scrambled back the way they came, casting terrified glances over their shoulders, their clumsy retreat a stark contrast to the silent dignity of the Lakota. They vanished into the trees, their intrusive noise swallowed by the ancient quiet of the canyon. The tension dissipated like smoke. The warriors melted back into the landscape as quietly as they had appeared. Only Wapasha, Chaitan, Winona, and Kuruk remained with Cora. The crisis was over. Chaitan approached her. He looked from her face down to her feet, raw and bloodied, but planted firmly on the earth. A deep, unspoken gratitude flowed from him. He reached into a pouch at his side and drew out her shoes. They were not as she remembered them. The cracked leather had been treated and softened. The broken seams were stitched with strong sinew. And along the sides, intricate patterns of tiny blue and white beads had been sewn, transforming her humble shoes into something beautiful, something sacred. He knelt before her, just as she had knelt before him days ago and gently took one of her feet in his hands. He cleaned it with a soft cloth and then slipped the repaired shoe onto it. He did the same with the other. The familiar comfort of them, now imbued with new meaning, was overwhelming. "The path is clear," Wapasha said gently. "It is time to finish." Leaning on Winona for support, Cora took the first steps toward the base of the mountain. Each step in her remade shoes felt different. She was no longer just walking on leather. She was walking on a foundation of shared sacrifice, respect, and a connection so deep it had been tested by fire and had not broken. The confrontation had not been an interruption of her journey. It had been its final, defining test. She had been asked to walk a path, but in that canyon she had learned to stand her ground. The final ascent was steep, a scramble over ancient weathered rock that felt like the spine of the world. The air grew thin and crystalline. With every upward step, the vast expanse of the prairie unfurled below them, a patchwork of gold and brown stretching to the curve of the earth. Cora moved in a state of exhausted grace, her body aching but her spirit alight. The pain in her feet had transformed into a dull, rhythmic pulse, a reminder of every step that had brought her to this place. She was no longer just Cora, the orphan from Providence. She was a walker of paths, a keeper of debts, a part of this land in a way she had never been. Winona and Chayton walked beside her, their presence a quiet, steady support. There was no need for words. They breathed the same thin air, their shadows merging on the stones. They were three people from different worlds, bound together by an act of impulsive kindness that had blossomed into a sacred obligation. At last, they reached the summit. It was a flat, wind-swept shelf of rock, dominated by a single, large, smooth stone that glowed with a faint warmth, even in the cool mountain air. The Sunstone. This was the terminus of the journey, the heart of the sacred mountain. Winona nodded toward it, her severe face softened by a look of profound reverence. "The journey ends here." Cora took a deep breath and stepped forward alone. She slipped off the beaded shoes Chayton had returned to her, placing them carefully to the side. Then, taking the final few steps, she placed her bare feet upon the sunstone. The rock was not hot, but alive with a gentle, pulsing energy that seemed to travel up through her soles, through her weary limbs, and into the very center of her being. It felt like a welcome, a coming home. She stood there, a small figure silhouetted against the immense sky, and looked out at the world. She saw the dusty plains, the distant smudge of the settlement, the winding silver thread of a river. But she saw it all with new eyes. It was no longer a hostile, empty place. It was a landscape of meaning, of spirit, of connection. The wind that had once whispered of loneliness now sang a song of belonging. The crushing weight of grief she had carried for 2 years seemed to lift, not vanishing but transforming into something lighter, something she could carry. The hole in her spirit, as Winona had called it, was not gone, but it was no longer a gaping void. It felt as if it were being filled with the light of the setting sun, with the strength of the mountain, with the quiet dignity of the people who had brought her here. She had fulfilled her debt, and in doing so, she had been made whole. When she finally stepped down, her journey complete, Chayton met her gaze. He spoke to her for the first time, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "Pilamaya," he said, "thank you. You have a strong spirit, Cora. You walk like one of us." In the weeks that followed, Cora did not return to the lean-to on the edge of Providence. There was nothing for her there but dust and ghosts. Her home was now in the bustling, vibrant camp of Chayton's people. She was formally welcomed, not as a guest or an oddity, but as kin, as the barefoot walker who had honored their ways. Winona became her teacher and her fiercest friend, showing her how to tan hides, how to read the stars, and how to laugh again, a sound that had been a stranger to Cora's own ears. She found her place. She helped the older women, played with the children, her quick mind and quiet resilience, earning her a unique position of respect. She learned their language, her tongue slowly mastering the soft consonants and flowing vowels, and in return, she taught some of the children the English words from her mother's old reading primer. One evening, sitting by a large communal fire, she watched Chaitan telling a story to a group of wide-eyed children. He was using his hands to show a small girl giving her shoes to a tired walker on a long path. The children listened, rapt. Cora looked down at her own feet, clad now in a pair of soft, beautifully beaded moccasins that Winona had made for her. Her old shoes, her last link to her former life, sat on a shelf in Winona's lodge, a revered object, a symbol of a bridge built between two worlds. She had arrived in this land as a forgotten orphan with nothing to her name but a single pair of broken shoes. In an act of pure, unthinking compassion, she had given them away. And in return, the universe, in its strange and unknowable wisdom, had given her back everything she had ever lost: a family, a purpose, and a home, not of splintered boards and dust, but of community, of spirit, and of the boundless, forgiving sky.